Hi, I'm Ralph Preston. I'm here with William Lowe, and we're doing another one of our roadmap discussions. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about shoulder, and we're going to start it off with William's going to talk about why it's important to maintain the structural integrity of your shoulder. So take it away, William.
Okay, so first and foremost, I just wanted to start by saying that in recovery after stroke, quite often it's quite quite often it's the shoulder getting back use of your shoulder can be really important because it's actually going to allow you to get back functional use of your hand. And a lot of times in recovery after stroke, when we see stroke survivors who have their arm and their elbow in flexion like this, it's because they haven't done a lot of foundational work on trying to get back their shoulder and trying to teach their brain how to send the signals like it used to before they had their stroke to get their shoulder going. So in recovery after stroke, I think especially in the early stages, if you're looking to want to progress towards more functional use of your hand further down the line where you can actually use it, it's really important to actually build up to actually build up and teach your brain how to send those signals to those muscles which are used to actually support movements in your shoulder, because quite often in recovery after stroke, the structural integrity of your shoulder is actually affected quite a lot in that your shoulder won't be able to move in the same functional range as it used to before you had your stroke. And this range is actually called scapulohumeral rhythm, which is basically a fancy term to describe how the muscles around your shoulder work together in unison to get your shoulder to move within a functional range so that you could do things which you used to do before your stroke as you went throughout your day. So I think that early on in your recovery after stroke, if you're not a fan of getting to a point in your recovery further down the line where you're going to be like this with your shoulder in close to your body and your hand and your fingers flexed in like this, it's really important to get the shoulder going. And what this means is really teaching your brain how to send the signals to turn on the muscles which support your scapula, as well as support your ability to actually lift up your shoulder, so that when it comes further down the line, you can actually teach your brain how to actually break out of this pattern where your arm and your shoulder are actually in close to your body, which then in turn allows you to actually use your hand in a more functional manner. Because your shoulder actually is used to actually position your hand in space so that you're able to do things on a day-to-day basis. And if you don't fix, or if you don't address the shoulder in the early stages and preserve that blueprint of how your brain used to send signals to turn on the shoulder or turn on muscles which are involved with your shoulder in your recovery after stroke early, then it's actually going to hurt you long term. So I think it really starts, I think all of this really starts from the very beginning of your recovery after stroke if you're just starting out. And earlier, myself and Ralph, we had a discussion about some of the things you could do to actually get your shoulder going so that you can teach your brain to actually remember and I guess maintain that blueprint of how it actually used to send signals to turn on muscles which are involved in moving the shoulder before you had your stroke, so that later down the line, you can actually move away from patterns such as having your shoulder and your arm close to your body and actually have your shoulder out by your side so that you're able to actually do things which you used to be able to do before you actually had your stroke.
All right. Well, I can tell you everybody some things that I did to get my shoulder going. Um, First two things I did are pretty simple. Basically, abduction, moving your hand or arm away from your body, because it's typically you're kind of flaccid in the early days and it's just hanging there. Um, so you want to build up some strength and some movement. So moving it away from your body is a good thing. In the beginning, I could only move it an inch or two. Another thing I did that also involves your hand, arm just kind of being to your side is drawing circles with, I drew circles with my index finger clockwise and counterclockwise. I'd heard about this in terms of getting your shoulder going, it's actually a variation of something called a pendulum, which is when you lean in, you can actually lean on a desk or something and swing your body, and if you have no movement at all, and you can get some swinging movement that maybe you can build on. I was able to move a little bit, so I just jumped right to circles. So another thing I did was fairly early on was weight bearing, and it's best if you can open your hand so your fingers are open. You can hold them with the other hand. If you have to, one thing you can do is you can, I did it outside on the deck railing, and I could put my fingers over the edge when they wouldn't open up, and I would hit the, I would do the weight bearing on the heel of my hand. So those were a couple things I did to get going. Oh, another way that you can do weight bearing is like corner push-ups. They're fairly easy. Just go into a corner, put your hands, and then like lean in like doing a push-up. That'll get some weight bearing and some movement going. Another thing I didn't do, but we've done it with a number of stroke survivors I worked with, was crawling, because crawling does some good weight bearing. Again, you know, you want to have, if you can, you want to have that hand open as much as possible. Let's see, what else? Of course, I did a lot of shoulder shrugs, shoulder rolls, scapula pinch, all those kinds of things. Let's see, what else did I do? To get my shoulder, I had a lot of trouble getting my shoulder above normal. Not normal, level. There's a reason for that. If you put your hand around your back and you grab your scapula and you move your arm up, you'll notice your scapula doesn't move much until you get here. Then all of a sudden your scapula starts moving with you in order for you to move your shoulder higher. So to everybody I've seen, I've worked with, and I can't say I've worked with hundreds, I've worked with 13 people. Every single one of them had, and everybody I've ever talked to had a like sticking point right there at level, and I think that's because of that. One thing that I did was I used the old dowel trick. You can also use a cane or an umbrella. It's basically, again, you have to be able to hold on. William, you one time mentioned using a putter because you didn't have to grab the putter. You could put the end of the putter in your hand. Anyway, you use a rod, a dowel, or whatever, and you push up with your strong hand. You push your affected hand up. And of course, like anything, when you're moving through a range of motion passively like that, forcing it with the other hand, what you want to do is be thinking about it so that you can take over eventually, you know, with totally voluntary movement. That's why we're doing all this work. Another good one is wax on, wax off, because you can do some weight bearing, and also it's like doing the circles. I'm a big believer in circular motion because it uses a lot of different muscles in consort. One muscle has to be tightening while the other is loosening. And so wax on, wax off has got the circular motion. You can lean into it and do some weight bearing, really scrub that counter even if it's clean. But again, you want to see if you can open up that hand, even if you have to hold your fingers down and hold it open with your other hand while you do it. Even if you have to do it with your other hand, you still watch that shoulder. That shoulder is moving. So, William, you had something to add about why it's important to have that hand open. You want to tell everybody here now?
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, I just wanted to second everything which Ralph has mentioned about some of the things which he used to get the shoulder going. I believe that they're all important because, like I mentioned, with maintaining the structural integrity of your shoulder and really getting your shoulder to move within that scapulohumeral rhythm, all of these exercises, they're actually encouraging your brain to send those signals to the muscles, which are actually used to support the shoulder as it moves through that range which it used to before you actually had your stroke. So I think those are all important, especially in the early stages when you really want to get your brain working hard, when you know that recovery is going to happen the quickest in those early phases of your stroke. Now, with relation to keeping the hand open, I believe that this is especially important early on in your recovery after stroke, because it actually helps to preserve your brain's memory of how it actually used to send those signals to keep the hand open before you actually had your stroke. Because what tends to happen in recovery after stroke, as a lot of stroke survivors might have experienced themselves, is that the fingers and the wrist, they actually tend to flex into a pattern like this. And if you let your brain get away with it, your brain can actually condition itself to let itself know that it's okay to actually let the fingers flex in like this. However, if you teach your brain and if you really police your brain and condition itself to keep those fingers splayed out and stretched out, especially early on in your recovery, when you're doing functional exercises such as wax on, wax off, exercises like Ralph mentioned, such as crawling exercises, if you're able to do that, then what you can really do is you can really capitalize in those early stages of your recovery after stroke. And not only can you teach your brain to condition itself to not allow itself to get those fingers in the flex position, but you can also give yourself a really good stretch, and you can actually encourage your brain to start sending signals to those muscles which are used to actually keep your fingers stretched out and I guess extended when you're doing those exercises as well. Because what actually happens when you're stretching out muscles is that those stretched muscles, they actually send a signal back to your brain to let it know that you're actually contracting, or you're turning on those muscles which are allowing your fingers to stay straight. So you can either be in a situation where you're wearing a arm sling, and you're allowing your hand and your shoulder to not really do anything and be close to your body like this, or you can take on an alternative approach where you're being very disciplined, and you're really teaching your brain and telling itself to do what ideally you would like it to do, which is keeping your hand stretched out and not clawed in, as well as strengthening up the shoulder, so that further down the line you won't be in a position where your brain is actually conditioned to actually want to do what it feels is the easiest thing to do, which is allowing this arm and the shoulder to go in close to the body like this, rather than wanting to go against that and having your arm stretched out and your shoulder out at the same time. So everything we're discussing right now, everything myself and Ralph have discussed right now, it's really about setting the foundations right early on in your recovery for your shoulder, so that further down the line, you can actually teach your brain to allow your shoulder to get into a more functional position, as well as your hand in a more functional position, so that you can actually get more use out of it. Because if you're not rigorously attacking your shoulder and really disciplining your brain to really send signals to turn on and off some of the muscles which are sent to some of those muscles which you use to support your shoulder early on in your recovery, then your brain isn't going to learn how to move the shoulder like it used to, especially in those early stages of recovery, when recovery happens the quickest, and when your brain is going to learn those habits the quickest as well. So I think early on, with what Ralph mentioned, with keeping the hands stretched out right, and also doing those basic exercises such as the shoulder rolls and the shoulder pinches, these are all great exercises because they all help your brain to maintain that blueprint of how it actually used to send signals to turn on and off muscles which are used to actually support and allow your shoulder to move through a similar range of motion which it used to before you had your stroke, so that further down the line in your recovery, you're actually able to get your shoulder and also your arm and hand in a more functional position for you to actually teach your brain how to learn the things which it needs to in order to progress in your recovery, whether this be uh, grasp and release exercises where you're picking up objects and you're using the shoulder to navigate your hand to get into positions to actually do the exercises and do the grasp and release exercises which you would like, rather than being at a position where you haven't addressed some of those muscles around your shoulder and you haven't trained up your brain to actually teach yourself how to get the shoulder in a functional position where it's not like this, and you're not actually able to do anything because you haven't set up those solid foundations. So I think, I mean, that was a whole roundabout way of explaining it, but I guess what I'm saying is that it's the importance of really making sure that you're keeping your hand outstretched when you're doing these exercises, is that you're really maintaining that blueprint in your brain of how it used to actually move the shoulder before you had your stroke, because it will quickly forget in your recovery after stroke. And as soon as you can tell your brain how to send those signals, then that's how you're going to quickly see more results and progress in your recovery.
I remembered one other thing that I did. I was lucky enough to have an occupational therapist in addition to the physical therapist, and so the occupational therapist dealt with my shoulder, and which I think is a good thing. Physical therapists will take them on, but I don't know. I like the idea of, seems more connected to the hand than the leg and walking. Anyway, she showed me some exercises I could do with resistance bands, and I did them. Of course, if you've got the one with the, you have to be able to grab it. If it's a soft like TheraBand, if it's one of the ones with the like handle on the end, you have to be able to get your hand around it. So it's maybe not a day one thing. The other thing was the exercises I think I didn't know at the time, but they're really fundamental to the way you move your shoulders. So one of them, and I just need to stop here and say, one of the most valuable things if you're going to use resistance bands that you can have is a little $3 or $4 nylon loop. It's called a door loop, and it's got a big wad of nylon on one end and a loop. And you put the wad on the other side of the door, you close the door, and now you got a loop that you can't pull through the door, and you can attach your resistance bands to it. So I used it a lot. I thought about it because one of the ones I did was pull down towards me. And then I would turn around and I would pull up. And both those, another good one was just moving in this range. And another one is, this one requires more work. It takes people a while to start doing this motion without I can't do it anymore because I've trained, and I don't want to. I've trained my brain to do it right. But in the early days, if you try and do that motion, you'll try and use all kinds of muscles you shouldn't, and trunk you shouldn't. So there's something that I found real valuable because they helped me really keep my shoulder in line when I was moving it, and they helped me build up strength. So TheraBands or exercise bands are one good way. I don't normally, pitch the YouTube channel or anything, but I just was realizing that a lot of the exercises like circles and abduction, weight bearing, wax on, wax off, the dowel, symmetry, which we didn't talk about, that's basically moving in bilaterally, moving both arms at the same time. They're all, I have videos of them all on the same YouTube channel that you're watching this on. So you can look for them there. In fact, there's a playlist called Shoulders. So here's my 30-second blatant pitch for videos. So people often watch this stuff, William, as you know, and then they want to know, well, where can I find a video? Because a lot of people like me, and I particularly like videos because I'm a visual learner. So you can find videos on most of the stuff we're talking about. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I just want to second everything that you mentioned about using the resistance bands. I think that resistance bands, especially once you build up especially once you've gotten to that stage where you've built up the foundation of movements in your shoulder, in your recovery after stroke, using some of the basic exercises such as your shoulder rolls or your shoulder pinches, they can actually come really in handy, the resistance bands, because they can actually expose your brain to a condition where you're actually applying what your brain actually learnt when it was using those basic exercises to get those signals going, to actually use to actually use some of the muscles which it might have got back and apply it towards a specific task where there's actually a target. So in this case, where you're using the exercise bands as a sort of pulley, while you're standing behind a door, so that you can actually move your shoulder against a range which you're aiming towards. So whether this be a range where you're trying to go up above your head, or a range where you're trying to go back just like you would if you're trying to pull the door closed at the same time. I think the resistance bands, they can be good because they give your brain a really good sense of feedback that it is actually turning on those muscles, and it actually is applying what it actually had learned earlier with the basic movements such as your shoulder rolls and shoulder pinches. And this will really give your brain an incentive to actually, I guess, really work hard to get back some of those movements which it used to do before you actually had your stroke, such as moving your shoulder back, moving your shoulder up towards that range as well. I think all of those things which you discussed, Ralph, where you said moving your shoulder around in circles, they're all really good because what you're doing is you're really encouraging your brain to move the shoulder through that complete range of motion which it used to operate in before you actually had your stroke. And by doing these types of things, you're helping to maintain that structural integrity of the shoulder. Like I mentioned earlier in in this in this conversation, your brain is actually going to forget how to learn how to send signals to turn on and off those muscles which it used to use to move your shoulder before you had your stroke in your recovery after stroke. And if you can keep promoting and if you can keep encouraging your brain to send those signals, you can help maintain the range of your shoulder in your recovery after stroke, so that further down the line, you're not going to be in a position where you're like this. Let's say if you didn't do any of these exercises and you just allowed your brain to get away with having your arm in a sling, and having that sling support the weight of your shoulder rather than teaching your brain how to support the weight of your shoulder by itself, by sending those signals to the muscles which are responsible for keeping your shoulder upright and stopping things like shoulder subluxation from happening.
Well, there are a number of good ones that are fairly simple. You know, stuff like you put the band in and you pull down like that. Well, then you turn around and grab it, face the other way, and you can pull it out, the opposite motion. You pull it straight up. And most of the things that you do with the bands keep you in the various gross motions that are important to. The only other thing you need is your wrist movement, you know, because when you pick up something, you know, your hand is a typical stroke hand's looking like this. So you can't pick up a glass until you can extend, until you can rotate, till you can take and make that C and rotate it and put it around the glass and clamp. Let's see, what else did I do? Oh, they told me I had shakes, and they told me they're going crosswise. So you can pull this way, then you can flip around, take the band, and pull back this way, the opposite way. Whatever I did things, I would do the opposite. So I would be pulling this way, and then I'd flip around, and I'd be pulling back that way. One of the things I really like about resistance bands is, well, they come in different strengths. So, you know, you can have a whole set and adjust the strength, or there's a really simple way to adjust the strength. If you need it to be a little easier, if you're using a door and one of those door loops, you just move a couple inches closer to the door and it gets easier. If you're progressing along, you want it to get harder, you just step back 6 inches and it'll get harder. So I like the variability of them because they're easily adapted to where you're at. The amount of resistance that you pull on is easily adapted to where you're at in your recovery. So
Yeah, definitely 100%. And I just want to add on to that although resistance bands are great, one thing you can really get the most benefit out of them is actually how you're actually using them in your recovery after stroke. So the most important thing to consider if you are going to use exercise bands is how you're actually going to perform your movements. In recovery after stroke, one thing that your brain tends to like to do is compensate, which basically means that it wants to turn on more muscles than necessary when it's performing exercises. So if you're doing exercise bands and it's your very first time, your brain may be tempted to turn on the entire trunk and twist to sort of get that movement going. So the best thing to do when it comes to exercise bands is to really make sure that you're maintaining the correct posture and the correct form. Because as myself and Ralph have discussed in previous roadmap discussions, it's really about quality over quantity. You don't want to let your brain get away with a little bit more than it can, especially when it comes to getting your shoulder going. So, I mean, unless you're a fan of twisting and turning for the rest of your life when you lift up your shoulder, with these exercises, such as your shoulder rolls and your shoulder pinches and your resistance bands, it's really important to make sure that you're doing them in a very controlled manner. And I know it's going to be slow, and it might, and 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 it will require a lot of patience, but I think it's going to pay off if you can, when it comes to strengthening up muscles around your shoulder, to really have isolated repetitions where you're really targeting some of those muscles which are going to help lift up your shoulder and help maintain that structural integrity or that range of motion in your shoulder in your recovery after stroke.
Well, I think that's one reason that the OT didn't really introduce them. Like the first week, I went for a month or so before we even talked about it, so that I had some. I was talking about so I can move in certain planes. So I didn't have much strength, but I had most of the range of motion, most of the planes, before we did that. So, and the other thing was, it was I did them once or twice a day. I mean, I did, weight bearing and wax on, and those more like 3 or 4 times a day. So I used them, and I recommend anybody, the more variety of exercises you can do, as far as I'm concerned, the better. So they're not the only thing that you would do. There's something that you would do as a part of your total exercise routine. So. Anything else, William, or should we wrap?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that everything myself and Ralph have discussed in this conversation, I think they all work together as a system, and especially when it comes to tackling recovery after stroke. If you're in a situation where you're just starting out in your recovery, and you're looking for what to expect, and you're looking for things you can do to get your shoulder going, so that you can get out of that arm sling in this position like that, then it's really got to start with addressing the foundational movements. And this is through exercises such as your shoulder rolls and your shoulder pinches, so that you can really set your brain up for success when it comes to your recovery after stroke. Because otherwise, your brain is going to actually want to hit the autopilot button and do things on its own agenda, which is pretty much allowing the shoulder and the elbow to go into close to the body like this. But when you have these exercises, such as your shoulder rolls, your shoulder pinches, and your exercise bands, and you're in a position where you're using all of these to really encourage your brain to send signals to turn on muscles and strengthen these muscles, which are used to support the weight of your shoulder and also allow your shoulder to move through that full range of motion, as well as maintain the, I guess, range of motion or structural integrity. Then what you're doing is you're really setting yourself up to get into a position where when your shoulder is strong enough to support itself, that you can actually allow yourself to actually see more improvements in your recovery, because you can actually move your shoulder a lot more. And in turn, by moving your shoulder a lot more, if you have any movement in your hand at that point in time, you can actually use your hand to actually do things to actually progress a lot more in your recovery after stroke.
Great. That plays, I thought of 2 more things I wanted to say, and that plays into one of them. The first one is our old familiar friend, core. Core is always important to everything. In the case of the shoulder, actually your core supports your shoulder. shoulder supports your arm, which supports your wrist, which supports your hand. They'll tell you that that's the normal progression. And normally it is in many, many cases. In my case, it wasn't. It worked exactly the opposite. My hand came back more readily than my shoulder, which was last. So we have a little mantra that we like to say, and that would be work what works. Don't don't wait to work your hand because somebody told you that, you get your shoulder back first, then your arm, and then your wrist, and then your hand. If your hand's working, work it. Right, William?
Yeah, definitely. Especially in those early stages of your recovery after stroke, I think it's important. Yeah, you can address your shoulder. That's a good thing. But for extra credit, if you obviously have the commitment and if you have time, what we would recommend is that you actually work on your hand as well, because one thing is one thing to which is really important to remember is that your hand actually guides the movement of your shoulder. When you think about how you used to actually move your shoulder before you had your stroke, you would never initiate movement from your shoulder like you would in your recovery after stroke, where you're lifting it up like a crane, but rather when you're reaching for something, your hand would actually guide the movement of your shoulder. If you're in a situation in your recovery after stroke where you haven't worked on your shoulder, and because of that, you're in a situation where your arm is flexing like this, and even though you might have some movement in your hand actually can't move. Your hand actually can't guide the movement of your shoulder because you're just going to be going up like that because you haven't done that foundational work. But if you're able to address and teach your brain how to send those signals to turn on and off and strengthen the muscles around your shoulder early on in your recovery after stroke, this will actually put you in a better position down the line in your recovery after stroke, because it's going to allow you to free up your hand so that you can actually use your hand to actually do things such as grasp and release activities. And these are activities where you're picking up balls and you're dropping them, just to share one example. And this is where you're really going to see more results in your recovery. And you're also going to be doing your brain a favor, because it's going to be a lot easier to allow your brain to connect dots between how it used to do things before your stroke versus how things are now in your recovery after stroke.
Well, just end this with one thing, and that's this is just what I did, but I don't see any harm in it. From the day I got home from the rehab hospital, every single day I worked my hand, my wrist, elbow straightening, my arm, my shoulder. Because like William was saying, they work in consort, and where you're putting your hand drives the way. You don't think about, okay, I'm going to move my shoulder, laterally or whatever. No, you say, I need that glass off the shelf. So it's driven from there. So I would recommend in almost all stroke recovery a multi-pronged approach. The more different kinds of exercises you can do, and the more time you can put in doing them, and the more you can learn about recovery and focus and what a focused recovery is for you, the better results you're going to get.
Yeah, that's right. And I agree 100%. You really got to police your brain in recovery after stroke. Otherwise, your brain is going to run on its own agenda, which is allowing the shoulder and the arm to come in close to the body. I'm just assuming any stroke survivor watching this conversation we're having, you don't want to be in a situation, 3, 4, 5 years down the track where your arm is close to your body like that and you can't do anything because your brain hasn't had the opportunity to actually learn how to send signals to strengthen up some of the muscles around the shoulder so that the arm is actually able to be freed from this position and away from the body at the same time.
All right, well, that about wraps it up for shoulders. Of course, we could talk for hours about it, but there's some basics, and I guess we'll see everybody next time when we pick another subject. So thanks for watching, and we'll see everybody then.